there is a sound that grief makes before it becomes a sound. It lives in the half-second between the moment your brain registers the words and the moment your body catches up. The doctor pauses too long. The phone rings at an hour when phones should not ring. The officer standing on your porch removes his hat, and you already know, because no one removes their hat on a porch with good news. And in that half-second, everything you have built, every assumption about how tomorrow is supposed to unfold, begins to slide off the table like a glass in slow motion. You can see it falling. You cannot stop it. Now imagine that half-second happening 4 times in a row. 4 messengers. 4 catastrophes. Each one arriving before the last one has finished speaking. Each one beginning with the same unbearable phrase. While he was still speaking, another messenger came. This is the story of a man named Job. And by the end of it, you will understand why the most dangerous prayer you will ever pray is not God, help me, but God, explain yourself. You will discover what happens when the most righteous man on the face of the earth screams at heaven, and heaven screams back. And you will see, perhaps for the first time, that God's silence was never absence, and that his answer was never the one anyone expected. Not Job, not his friends, not even the audience watching from the other side of 3,000 years. If you have ever sat in the wreckage of something you did not cause, if you have ever been punished for a sin you did not commit, if you have ever looked at the ceiling at 2 in the morning and whispered why to a God who did not whisper back, then this story was written for you before you were born. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because what comes next will follow you home. The land of Uz sits at the edge of the known world, east of everything familiar, where the desert spreads out like a table set for no one. The mornings come gold and heavy, and the air by midday carries the smell of dust and animal hide, and the faint sweetness of grain being threshed in open courtyards. This is where Job lives. And Job is not a man who blends into his surroundings. He is the wealthiest man in the East. 7,000 sheep dot the hillsides like scattered clouds fall into earth. 3,000 camels move through trade routes his name controls. 500 yoke of oxen. 500 donkeys. Settlements depend on Job's generosity as surely as they depend on rain. But the livestock and the land are not what define him. Job has 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. And every morning, before the sun finishes climbing above the eastern ridge, before the first servant stirs the coals in the kitchen, Job is already awake. He stands in the gray light of pre-dawn, his robe pulled tight against the cool air, and he offers burnt offerings for each of his children by name. Not because they have sinned, because they might have. Because somewhere in the laughter of last night's feast, in the wine and the music and the carelessness of youth, one of them might have cursed God in their heart without even knowing it. And Job cannot bear the thought. The smoke rises from the altar, thin and white against the pale sky, and Job watches it climb until it disappears. His lips move. He's praying. He is always praying. The man carries his children before God, the way a father carries a sleeping child from a car to a bed, gently, carefully, aware of every shifting weight. This is not performance. No one is watching. Job prays because Job fears God, and not with the fear that cowers, but with the fear that loves too much to be careless. He is, by every measure that heaven and earth can apply, blameless. Not sinless. Blameless. A man whose integrity is so consistent that it has become the fabric of his identity. Not something he does, but something he is. And God knows it. In the courts of heaven, in a scene Job will never witness. God turns to the adversary, the accuser, the one called Satan, and says the words that will set the world on fire. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. Blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. He does not know it yet." Standing at that altar with smoke still clinging to his beard, Job does not know that his name has been spoken in a courtroom he cannot see, that everything he has built and everyone he has loved has just become the proving ground for a question that will echo through every century that follows. Does Job fear God for nothing? The answer is coming, and it will arrive on the lips of 4 breathless men. The first messenger comes running. You can hear him before you see him, sandals slapping packed earth, breath ragged, the kind of running that is not exercise, but emergency. He reaches Job, and his words tumble out, still tangled in panic. The Sabaeans attacked. The oxen, the donkeys, gone. The servants who were plowing, dead. Swords, all of them. He alone escaped. Job's face changes, the tightening around the eyes. His hand reaches for something to steady himself, finds nothing, and drops back to his side. 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys. The servants who tended them, men he knew by name. Gone. And while that messenger is still speaking, a second man arrives. This one's robe is singed. His eyebrows are gone. He smells like something no one should ever smell. The mingling of burning wool and burning flesh. "Fire from the sky," he gasps. "The sheep, all 7,000. The shepherds, burned alive. He alone escaped." Job's knees soften. Something behind his eyes begins to fracture. 7,000 sheep. Fire from the sky. This came from above. Before his mind can organize what he has heard, a third messenger crashes through the gate. The Chaldeans, 3 raiding parties. The camels, all 3,000, seized. The servants, killed. He alone escaped. The phrase repeats like a curse. He alone escaped. He alone escaped. As if survival itself has become a wound, as if living through the destruction is its own kind of dying. Maybe you know what it feels like to receive news that arrives in layers. The call from the hospital followed by the call from the bank. The diagnosis on Tuesday. The betrayal on Thursday. Your hands are full, and everything is still falling through. Job is standing in the courtyard. The air around him has changed. Tastes like metal. The sun is the same sun that rose this morning over a man who had everything, and now it shines on a man watching everything turn to smoke and blood and silence. And then the 4th messenger arrives. This one cannot run. He stumbles. He falls at Job's feet, and the sound that comes from his mouth is not a report. It is a moan that shapes itself into words the way a wounded animal shapes itself into a crawl toward shelter. Your sons, your daughters, they were eating. They were drinking wine in the eldest brother's house. A wind came, a great wind from the wilderness. It struck the 4 corners of the house. The house collapsed. They are dead. All of them. He alone escaped. The courtyard goes silent. Even the wind seems to pause. Somewhere in the distance, a goat bleats, and the sound is almost obscene in its ordinariness, life continuing its stupid rhythm, while a father stands in the center of his own unmaking. 10 children. Not 1. Not 2. 10. Every face he prayed over this morning. Every name he carried before God at the altar where the smoke has now gone cold. The daughters who laughed when he sang off key. The sons who argued at the table and then embraced in the doorway. Gone. All of them. Buried under timber and stone, while the wine was still wet on their lips. Job stands. The world tilts. And then he does something that no grief manual, no counselor, no theologian can fully explain. He tears his robe. The sound of the fabric ripping is sharp and deliberate, not an accident, but a declaration. He takes a blade and draws it across his scalp, and his hair falls to the dust in dark clumps. He is unmade, stripped, and then he falls. Not collapses. Falls. Purposefully. Face to the ground, forehead pressed into the dirt, dust in his nostrils, grit between his teeth. The posture of total surrender, or total defeat, or both. And from the dirt, from the lowest position a human body can assume, Job opens his mouth and speaks words that will be repeated in funeral homes and hospital hallways and midnight bedrooms for the next 3,000 years. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. No one in that courtyard moves. No one breathes. The words hang in the air the way a single note hangs after a bell has been struck, vibrating, refusing to fade. And the question that every person who has ever read this passage must ask is this: is this faith? Or is this shock? Is this the highest expression of worship ever recorded by a human tongue? Or is this the numb reflex of a man whose nervous system has shut down because the truth is too large to fit inside a conscious mind? The answer may be both, and that may be the most terrifying thing about it. But this is not the end of what Job will lose. What is coming next will make even the ashes feel like mercy. The boils begin without warning. One morning, Job wakes, and his skin is on fire. Not the fire of fever, which burns from inside and can be cooled with wet cloth. This fire lives on the surface. Every pore, every fold, every inch of skin from the sole of his foot to the crown of his now bare head erupts in sores that weep and crack and bleed when he moves. The pain is not sharp. It is deep. It radiates into the muscle beneath the skin, into the bone beneath the muscle, until his entire body becomes a single unbroken wound that has no edge and no center and no relief. He finds a broken piece of pottery. The edge is rough and curved, and he drags it across his skin, not to heal, but to scrape. The scraping removes the crust that forms over the sores, and for a few seconds the raw flesh beneath is exposed to the air, and the air is cool, and the coolness is the closest thing to relief that exists in his world. It doesn't last. The sores weep again. The crust reforms. He scrapes again. It is a cycle that has no resolution, only repetition, and the repetition becomes its own kind of madness. He sits in ashes, not beside the ashes, in them. The ash heap outside the city, where the broken pots and animal bones are discarded, where the flies gather in clouds so thick they hum like a single living instrument. This is where the wealthiest man in the East now lives. The house still stands, but it is empty of children, and an empty house that once held 10 laughing voices is not a house. It is a museum of what used to be. His wife comes to him. She stands at the edge of the ash heap and looks at what remains of the man she married. Her face is a landscape of its own destruction. She has lost the same 10 children. She carried each of them, felt them kick beneath her ribs, nursed them through fevers. And now she watches her husband, the last person she has left, sitting in garbage, scraping his ruined skin with a piece of a broken pot. And something inside her that has been holding its shape finally gives way. "Curse God and die," she says. The words are not cruel. That is the part most people miss. She's not a villain. She's a mother of 10 dead children standing in front of a husband she cannot help, and she is offering the only mercy she can imagine. If he curses God, God will strike him dead, and the pain will stop. It is the theology of desperation, the prayer of a woman who has run out of prayers. Job looks at her. His eyes are swollen nearly shut. His lips are cracked and bleeding. And he says, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" It is not a rebuke. It is a question, spoken not with the confidence of a man who has an answer, but with the trembling voice of a man who is holding on to the last thread of something he cannot see and hoping it holds. The "we" matters. He is pulling her into the same impossible choice. We said God was good when the wine flowed and the children sang at the table. Shall we accept only that? Or is there something in the nature of God that remains true even when the evidence has turned to ash? She does not answer. Or if she does, the text does not record it. She disappears from the story like a door closing quietly in another room, and Job is alone again. Maybe you have heard those words before. Maybe someone who loved you, someone who had watched you suffer long enough, looked at you and said the equivalent of, "Curse God and die." Maybe they said, "Why are you still going to that church?" Maybe they said, "If God is real, why would he let this happen to you?" And maybe the hardest part wasn't that they were wrong. The hardest part was that you understood why they said it. 3 men hear the news: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They come from different cities, different lives, but they share a common destination. And whatever damage they will eventually inflict, this must be acknowledged. They showed up. When the rest of the world moved on, when the neighbors looked away, these 3 men packed provisions and crossed the distance. They see him from far off, and they do not recognize him. The man sitting on the ash heap does not look like Job. His body is a ruin. His face is so swollen and disfigured that the features they once knew are gone, replaced by something that looks less like a man and more like suffering itself, given a shape and told to breathe. They weep, they tear their own robes, and then they do the most extraordinary thing they will ever do. They sit down, on the ground, in the ashes, next to him, and they do not speak. For 7 days and 7 nights, no one says a word. The silence between them is thick and holy. Flies land on the sores, and Job does not bother to wave them away, because they understand, at least in this moment, that there are griefs too large for language, and the only adequate response is presence. What kind of friends sit with you for 7 days without speaking, and then spend the next 35 chapters making everything worse? Eliphaz opens his mouth first. His voice is careful, measured, the voice of a man who believes he is being gentle. "Consider now," he says, "who, being innocent, has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed?" The question sounds like comfort. It is not. It is an accusation wrapped in silk. If the innocent do not perish, and Job is perishing, then Job is not innocent. The logic is clean. The logic is merciless. And the logic is wrong. Bildad follows. He appeals to tradition. Does God pervert justice? He asks. When your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. The words land like stones thrown into an open wound. Your children. Their deaths were their own fault. Zophar is the bluntest. Know this, he says, God has even forgotten some of your sin. You are getting less than you deserve. 3 friends, 3 variations of the same lie. Suffering is always a receipt for sin. The universe is a vending machine. You put in righteousness, you get out blessing. You put in sin, you get out punishment. And if the machine has spit out ashes and boils and 10 dead children, then the input must have been corruption, no matter what the outside of the coin looked like. This is the theology that turns hospitals into courtrooms. This is the system that makes the sufferer responsible for their suffering and calls it wisdom. Maybe you have met these friends, and maybe they sat in your living room or stood in the church lobby and said things that sounded like scripture but felt like knives. God doesn't give you more than you can handle. Everything happens for a reason. And you nodded because you did not have the energy to argue. But inside, something screamed because you knew. You knew with the same certainty that Job knew, that you had not done the thing they were accusing you of, and their comfort had become a second wound laid on top of the first. Job does not confess. That is the hinge on which the entire story turns. The pressure to fabricate a sin just to make the conversation stop is enormous. One false confession, and the friends would nod, and the theological system would remain intact, and everyone could go home. But Job refuses. He refuses because it would be a lie. And a lie spoken to end suffering is still a lie. His integrity is the only thing the catastrophe did not take. The sheep are gone. The camels are gone. The children are gone. The health is gone. But his integrity remains, and he grips it the way a drowning man grips a plank, not because the plank is comfortable, but because letting go means sinking into something worse than the waves. The night comes. The ash heap is dark now. The fires that burn the refuse have died down to a faint orange glow that pulses and fades with the wind. The stars are out, thick and cold and impossibly distant, and Job sits beneath them with his knees drawn up to his chest, and his arms wrapped around his shins, and his forehead resting on his kneecaps, and his breath coming in shallow, ragged pulls. He is alone. The aloneness is not merely physical. It is cosmic. He is alone in his theology because his friends are wrong, and he knows it. He is alone in his suffering because no one can climb inside his skin and feel what he feels. He is alone in his faith because the God he worships has not spoken, has not explained, has not even acknowledged that Job is still breathing. A dog barks somewhere in the distance. The sound carries across the flat ground and reaches Job and fades into the dark. A cricket begins and stops. The wind shifts and brings the smell of something dead, a sheep, perhaps, left too long in the sun. And Job opens his cracked mouth and speaks into the darkness words that are not worship and not blasphemy, but something between the two. The raw prayer of a man who will not let go of God, but will not pretend that holding on does not hurt. Now, if only I knew where to find him, if only I could go to his dwelling, I would state my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. Job 23, verses 3 and 4. Read that again. Let those words settle. This is not a man who has lost his faith. This is a man whose faith has become a fist pounding on a door that will not open. He is not walking away from God. He is walking toward God with a legal brief in his hand, demanding a hearing, insisting that the judge who sentenced him to this ash heap take the stand and explain himself. Not Lord, help me, not Lord, forgive me, but Lord, face me. Let me argue my case, because I have done nothing wrong, and this silence is killing me slower than the boils. Job's faith is not gone. It has been stripped of every comfort, every cliché, every easy answer, and what remains is the skeleton of something indestructible. He believes God exists. He believes God is just. And those two beliefs are now at war with everything he can see, hear, touch, and feel. But somewhere deeper than skin, deeper than ash, deeper than the voices of three men who have confused their theology for truth, Job knows something. He does not know what it is yet. but he knows it is there, and he will not let go. Maybe tonight is your night on the ash heap. Maybe your version of the three friends is a comment section, a family dinner, a church that gave you answers when what you needed was presence. And maybe you have whispered your own version of Job's prayer. Where are you? Why is this happening? I need you to say something, anything, even if it's something I don't want to hear. If that is you, then stay, because God is about to answer, but not in the way anyone expects. The silence lasts longer than anyone expected. Days fold into weeks. The arguments circle and circle, and Job answers each one with the same unbending refusal. I have not sinned. I will not confess to something I did not do. The ash heap becomes a courtroom where no verdict is possible, because the judge has not arrived, and the prosecution is working from a textbook that does not apply to the case. Then a young man speaks. His name is Elihu. He has been sitting at the edge of the argument, silent, burning, waiting for his elders to finish. He is angry at Job for justifying himself rather than God, angry at the three friends for condemning Job without an adequate answer. He points to the sky. He talks about clouds and rain and lightning and the breath of God turning water to ice. And as his voice rises with conviction, something changes. The air shifts, a coolness where there was heat, a pressure drop that makes the ears feel full. The dust on the ground begins to stir. Not the lazy drift of a breeze, a pull, as if the air itself is being gathered, drawn toward a point on the horizon where the sky has begun to darken in a way that is not clouds and not night, but something else entirely. Elihu stops speaking. His mouth is still open, but his eyes have moved to the western sky, where the darkness is building with a speed that does not belong to weather. Every set of eyes on that ash heap is now fixed on the horizon, disappearing behind a wall of spinning wind and dust climbing from the ground to the heavens. The whirlwind, it does not build gradually. It arrives. A vibration that enters through the soles of the feet and climbs the spine and settles in the chest cavity and makes the ribs hum. The ash lifts from the ground in sheets. Job's torn robe whips against his body. Whatever is inside this storm is not asking for permission to be here. And then God speaks, not through a prophet, not through a dream. God speaks from the center of the whirlwind, and the first words out of his mouth are not an answer. They are a question. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? 35 chapters of debate, hundreds of carefully constructed arguments, and one sentence from the whirlwind reduces all of it to dust. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Job asked for a hearing. He demanded an audience, and now the court is in session. But the roles are reversed. Job is not the plaintiff. He is the witness. And the questions that come next will not explain his suffering. They will explode the framework in which he believed suffering needed to be explained. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Job 38, verses 4 through 7. Let those words settle. Sit with that for a moment. Job hears these words and his arguments dissolve like salt in water. He came with a legal brief, and the response he receives is not a defense, it is a tour. God does not take the stand. God takes Job's hand and walks him to the edge of creation and says, "Look, you want to understand the architecture of your suffering? First tell me if you understand the architecture of a single sunrise. The questions pour from the whirlwind. Have you ever given orders to the morning? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Does the hawk take flight by your wisdom? Each question is a world. God is showing Job the scope of what he is asking to understand. You want to comprehend why your children died? First, comprehend why the morning star sings. This is not cruelty. God is not saying, "You are small and I am big, so shut up." God is saying, "You are operating with a fraction of the information, and the fraction you hold is not large enough to support the conclusions you are drawing. Your suffering is real. Your pain is legitimate. But the framework you are using to interpret that pain, the framework that says if I loved you, then this would not be happening, that framework is built on an assumption that you can see what I see. And you cannot. Not because you are stupid, because you are human." He speaks of Behemoth, the great beast that eats grass like an ox, but whose power is in its hips and whose strength is in the muscles of its belly. He speaks of Leviathan, the sea creature whose back is rows of shields, whose breath kindles coals. These are not zoology lessons. They are portraits of things God has made that Job cannot control, cannot tame, cannot even approach without trembling. And the point is not that Job is weak. The point is that the God who can play with Leviathan like a bird on a string is the same God who sits with Job on the ash heap. And if that God has unexplained himself, it is not because he does not care. It is because the explanation lives in a language that human vocal cords cannot pronounce, and human ears cannot decode. At least not yet. At least, not on this side of the story. Picture yourself standing at the base of that whirlwind. The dust is in your eyes. The sound fills every space inside your skull. And the voice is not angry, not gentle, not anything you can categorize. But it is close. Closer than it has ever been. Closer than all the nights you spent praying into silence. The voice is here. And it is asking you questions you cannot answer. And every question strips away one more layer of the armor you built to protect yourself from the vulnerability of not knowing. There is a moment in every person's spiritual life when the questions stop working. When the why you have been asking hits a wall that is not silence and not refusal, but sheer immensity. You have been trying to fit God into the shape of your crisis, trying to make him small enough to answer you on your terms, and suddenly you realize that the reason the answer has not come is not that God is ignoring you, but that the answer is so much larger than the question that the question itself has to be rebuilt from the ground up. This is the difference between theology and encounter. For theology is the map, encounter is the territory. Job had the map. He had the best map available. He was blameless. He feared God. He knew the right things to say at the altar when the smoke rose in the morning. But the map is not the land. Knowing about God is not the same as being undone by God. And on this ash heap, in this whirlwind, Job crosses the border from one to the other. Job opens his mouth. After 4 chapters of questions, after the most overwhelming display of divine power ever directed at a single human being, Job speaks. And what comes out is not a confession of sin, because he has not sinned. What comes out is something far more profound. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job 42, verse 5. Read that again. So my ears had heard of you. Past tense. Everything before this moment, every prayer at the altar, every sacrifice for his children, every night of faithful obedience, all of it was hearing. Real hearing. The kind of hearing that made him the most righteous man on earth. but hearing. Now my eyes have seen you, present tense. Something has happened that no amount of righteousness could produce. Job has seen God, not with the eyes in his swollen, crusted, barely opened face, with something deeper, something that opened inside him when the whirlwind blew away every framework, every assumption, every theological scaffolding that stood between him and the raw, unfiltered, terrifying, beautiful presence of the living God. He repents, but not of sin. He repents of the smallness of his understanding. He came wanting a reason. He received instead the reasoner. He came demanding an explanation. He received instead the explainer. And the explainer is so much larger than any explanation could ever be, that Job does the only thing a finite being can do in the presence of the infinite. He puts his hand over his mouth, not because he has been silenced, because he has been filled. The wound is still there. The children are still dead. The sores still weep. But something has shifted at the foundation of his being, and the landscape will never look the same. Think about the last time you were not studying God, but stunned by Him, when the verse you had read 100 times suddenly read you, when the prayer you had been reciting by rote suddenly became a conversation, when you stopped performing worship and started falling into it, the way you fall into water, not because you chose to, but because the ground beneath you gave way. That is what happened to Job. The ground gave way. The frameworks collapsed, and what he fell into was not darkness, it was God. Job never got his explanation, not in chapter 38, not in chapter 42, not ever. The why never comes, but the who does. And Job, the man who said he would approach God like a prince with a legal brief in his hand, stands in the aftermath of the whirlwind with an empty mouth and full eyes, and says something that sounds nothing like a legal argument, and everything like a love letter written by a man who has been broken open and found that what was inside him all along was a capacity for God that his comfort had never required him to access. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The words return. The same words from the courtyard, from the day the messengers came, from the moment when the robe was torn and the hair was shaved and the face hit the dirt. But they don't sound the same. In the courtyard, they sounded like shock, the reflex of a nervous system in collapse. Now they sound like freedom. Nakedness is no longer about what was stripped away. It is about what remains when everything else is gone. And what remains, Amon, what has always remained, what the sheep and the camels and even the children were never meant to replace, is the presence of God Himself. The presence that cannot be taken because it was never earned. The presence that arrived not in the answer, but as the answer. If you are in your own whirlwind right now, if the questions are louder than the silence, and the silence is louder than your faith, type, "I have not yet seen" in the comments. Not as an admission of failure, as a declaration of hunger, because the seeing is coming. It may come in the form of a question you cannot answer that cracks you open wide enough for God to fit through. And that cracking, as painful as it is, may be the most merciful thing that has ever happened to you. Job rises from the ash. His sores have not healed. His children have not returned. So nothing in his external circumstances has changed. But the man inside the circumstances is not the same man who sat down. His hands are open. His palms face the sky. And somewhere in the distance, so faint it might be imagination, there is the sound of birds resuming their song, the way birds do after a storm has passed and the world remembers it is allowed to continue. But God is not finished. The whirlwind answered Job, Now God turns to the friends. God speaks to Eliphaz, not to Bildad first, not to Zophar. Eliphaz, the eldest, the one who spoke first, the one who opened his mouth after 7 days of holy silence and let the first poisoned word fall into the ash. I am angry with you and your 2 friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has. Job 42, verses 7 and 8. Let those words settle. The system Eliphaz spent 35 chapters constructing, the airtight argument that suffering is always a receipt for sin, that God operates on a transactional ledger where obedience purchases safety, is not gently corrected. It is condemned. God does not say, "You made some valid points but missed the nuance." God says, "You have not spoken the truth about me." The 3 men who arrived as comforters and became prosecutors now stand accused themselves. And the charge is not that they were unkind, although they were. The charge is that they were wrong about God. They spoke confidently about a God they had reduced to a formula, and the formula was a lie. This matters tonight, in the living room where someone is being told that their depression is a faith problem. This matters in the hospital chapel, where someone is being told that if they believed harder, the tumor would shrink. This matters in every conversation where a suffering human being is handed a theological equation instead of a hand to hold. But God does not destroy the friends. He does something far more disorienting. He tells them to go to Job, to take 7 bulls and 7 rams. And then, my servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. The man they accused must now intercede for them. The man who sat in the ashes while they delivered lectures must now raise his ruined hands and pray on their behalf, because without his prayer, they face the very judgment they spent 35 chapters assigning to him. Maybe you know what this costs. Maybe there is a name in your life, a person who was supposed to be your comfort, and instead became your wound. And maybe the thought of praying for that person, not in the abstract, bless my enemies way, but in the specific, kneeling, naming them before God way, makes something inside your stomach tighten. Because forgiveness is not a feeling, it is a posture. And the posture costs more than the feeling ever could. Job pros. The text does not record the words. It does not need to. The man who was wrongly accused opens his mouth and speaks to God on behalf of the men who wrongly accused him. The innocent one standing in the gap for the guilty. 3,000 years before, a cross is raised on a hill outside Jerusalem. And the text says something remarkable. The Lord restored Job's fortunes after Job prayed for his friends. Not after the whirlwind, not after Job's repentance. After Job prayed for them. As if the act of intercession was itself the doorway through which restoration entered. The Lord gives Job twice as much as he had before. But the numbers are not the point. 14,000 sheep do not explain why 10 children died. Restoration is not the meaning of the suffering. Restoration is what God does after the suffering, which is a different thing entirely. The meaning was in the whirlwind. The meaning was in the seeing. And yet, God, who does not owe Job a single sheep, gives him double. Not because Job earned it, because God is the kind of God who sits with a man in ashes and then leads him out into a green field, not as payment, but as an expression of a character that cannot stop giving. And then, the children. God gives Job 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. The same number, not double. The first 10 children are not replaced. They are not erased from the count. They are still Job's. They exist, somewhere beyond the collapsed house and the great wind, in the hands of the same God who laid the foundations of the earth. The 7 sons and 3 daughters, born in the aftermath, are not replacements. They are additions. The daughters are named Jemima, Keziah, Keren-Happuch. In a culture where daughters are often counted but not named, these 3 are given names, and the names are beautiful. Jemima means dove. Keziah means cinnamon. Keren-Happuch means container of antimony, a reference to beauty itself. And the text adds, "Nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father granted them an inheritance along with their brothers." An inheritance, in a time when daughters did not inherit. Job, the man who lost everything, gives his daughters a share equal to his sons. The man who emerged from the ash heap does not rebuild the old world. He builds a better one. A world where the old walls that kept certain people from the table are quietly taken down by a man whose suffering taught him that the table should be wider than tradition demands. Job lives 140 years after the restoration. He sees his children and his grandchildren to the 4th generation. Think about what that means. 140 years of mornings. 140 years of sunrises watched from the same eastern ridge where he once offered sacrifices in the gray light before dawn. But now, when the smoke rises, it does not carry fear. It carries something else, not certainty. Job never received certainty. He never received the explanation. He carries something better than certainty. He carries sight. He has seen. And the seeing changes the quality of every day that follows, the way a single candle changes the quality of a dark room, not by eliminating the darkness, but by proving that the darkness was never the final word. If you are in the ash heap tonight, if the restoration has not come, if the friends are still talking, and the sores are still weeping, and the whirlwind has not yet arrived, then hear this. The book of Job does not promise that your suffering will be doubled into blessing on this side of eternity. What it promises is older and deeper and more terrifying and more beautiful than any of those things. It promises that God is not a formula, that He is wild and immense and closer than breath and further than the Pleiades, and that He speaks from whirlwinds and knows the exact number of hairs on the head He shaved in grief. It promises that the silence is not absence, that the unanswered question is not proof of an uncaring God, but evidence of an answer too large to fit inside the question. And it promises this: your Redeemer lives. Job said those words from the ash heap, not from the restored estate, not from the table surrounded by 7 sons and 3 daughters, with names like Dove and Cinnamon and Beauty. From the ash, so from the place where the sores were fresh and the friends were relentless, and the silence from heaven was so loud it made the ears ring. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that, in the end, He will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see Him with my own eyes. I, and not another. How my heart yearns within me. Job 19, verses 25 through 27. Read that again. This is not the prayer of a man who has received his answer. This is the prayer of a man who hasn't received his answer and believes anyway. This is faith at its most raw, most naked, most exposed. And from that stripped, bare, trembling place, Job declares that his Redeemer is not dead, not absent, alive, and coming. And the day will arrive when Job will see Him, not hear about Him, see Him, with his own eyes, his and not another's. That declaration, spoken from the lowest point a human being can occupy, is the spine of the entire book. The spine is a man in ashes who has lost everything and been accused by everyone and heard nothing from God, and still, with cracked lips and bleeding gums says, "My Redeemer lives." Father, I pray over every person hearing these words, over the one sitting in ashes they did not choose, in a crisis they did not cause. Lord, you who spoke from the whirlwind and asked questions that broke a righteous man open wide enough to finally see, speak now, not in explanation, in presence. I pray for the one who has torn their robe and does not know if they will ever wear a whole garment again. Let the tearing become a doorway. I pray for the one who has been naked before you and did not choose it. Let them hear that naked is not the same as abandoned, that empty hands are the only hands wide enough to receive what you are about to give. And I pray for the one who has not yet seen, whose ears have heard, whose theology is sound, but whose eyes have not yet opened. Let the whirlwind come. Let everything that can be shaken, until the only thing left standing is the thing that cannot be shaken. And let that thing have your face. In the name of the one who stood in our ash heap and prayed for us while we were still accusing him. Amen. The ash heap is empty now. The wind has settled. The ground where Job sat is quiet. And if you were to walk across it, you would not know that this unremarkable stretch of dirt was the place where a man lost everything, gained God, and discovered that the gaining was worth more than the losing. Not because the pain was small, but because the presence was so impossibly, unbearably large. Your Redeemer lives. Not when the suffering ends. Not when the friends stop talking. Not when the explanation arrives. Now, tonight, in the room where you are sitting, in the silence you are afraid of, in the ash you did not choose. He lives. And he is not waiting for you to understand him. He is waiting for you to see him. And the seeing will be enough. It has always been enough. Share this with someone who is sitting in ashes and has been told it is their fault. Share it with the friend who is one conversation away from giving up. Share it with the person who has stopped asking why and needs to know that the silence was never empty.